All right, hello there. Welcome to my channel. My name is Dustin, or welcome back to my channel if you're returning today. I'm going to be talking about Friedrich Nietzsche, Fyodor Dostoevsky's Rodian Raskolnikov from Crime and Punishment, and Paul Atreides from Dune. So, last year, I read a whole bunch of Friedrich Nietzsche. Basically, this pile that you see right here, okay? In chronological order: Human All Too Human, The Dawn of Day, The Joyous Science, Thus Spoke Zarathustra would be next. Then Beyond Good and Evil, The Genealogy of Morals, Twilight of the Idols, and The Antichrist. But specifically, I'll talk about this book, Thus Spake Zarathustra. I'm not going to really talk too much about it. I'm just going to talk about the concept of the Ubermensch, the Overman, and how that relates to Rodian Raskolnikov from Crime and Punishment, who's like a proto-Ubermensch, because actually Dostoevsky wrote this in 1866, started in January, and completed this in December of 1866. It was published in the full book form in 1867. I'm reading the Richard Pevere and Larissa Volkonsky translation, although I have read the Sidney Moniz translation put out in the Signet's Classic Edition twice. This is my third read. And I noticed something between this and I'm currently rereading Frank Herbert's Dune in anticipation of Dune Part 3 by Denis Villeneuve, which is going to come out at the end of 2026. So I thought I should read at least the first 3 books again this year. But after reading all this Nietzsche and now reading these at the same time, I'm noticing some weird parallels, and I thought my brain just kind of went, whoa, I had the spice agony, and I got prescient vision, I became the Quetzalcoatl Haderach. I'm joking, I didn't. But anyways, got some notes, jotted down. I'm going to try not to take too much of your time, but I hope that you find this interesting, because I found these correlations, and let's go. Let's roll it out. So here we go. We'll be talking, as I said, this intro, the convergence of Friedrich Nietzsche's philosophy, specifically as it relates to the Ubermensch and will to power, Paul Atreides from Dune, and Rodian Raskolnikov from Crime and Punishment. This is going to center on, as I said, the Ubermensch, the will to power, but the dangers of elevating oneself above conventional morality. Now, I spoke briefly on this when I talked about the movie Apocalypse Now by Francis Ford Coppola, because I read Joseph Conrad's novel Heart of Darkness, and that touched on Nietzschean concepts as well. And Tyler Durden in Fight Club. Okay, I just reread the Chuck Palahniuk novel and rewatched the film. So if you're interested in this philosophical gobbledygook, you can go watch those videos, although I'm going to try to make this one shorter so that I don't fry your attention span. Now, Raskolnikov in Crime and Punishment acts as a proto-Nietzschean figure, because Nietzsche does not write really about the Ubermensch until Thus Spoke Zarathustra, and this is like in the 1870s. So Nietzsche predates him, Dostoevsky predates him in writing about this. In Dune, in Crime and Punishment, Raskolnikov is kind of like a failed Ubermensch, whereas Paul Atreides is the tragic success of the Ubermensch, or what happens when you become the Overman. So before we get into talking about that, we should probably talk about Nietzsche's concept of the Overman or the Ubermensch and what that is. So, philosophical foundations. In Friedrich Nietzsche's Thus Spoke Zarathustra, he proposes the idea of the Ubermensch. The Ubermensch is somebody that transcends values and creates their own value set. So they reject traditional values, traditional morality, and then they create their own sets of values for themselves, right? In essence, they go beyond good and evil, which is the title of one of Nietzsche's other books, and he talks about this concept of values and where they come from. throughout all of his works. But essentially, Nietzsche rejects metaphysics, okay? And he writes about this. He talks about the death of God. God is dead. Not that he ever believed that God actually died, but that he just rejects metaphysics, the idea of like Plato and Socrates, Christians, ethics, and all that. He just jettisons it all out the window. He says, God is dead. This is all based upon new theories of the time, the Enlightenment, Darwinism, the idea that there's just materialism. And he rejects metaphysics. And with no longer having God as kind of like the ground of truth, Nietzsche says there is no truth, and you have to create your own truth, right? So he comes up with this idea of the will to power. And he says this is the driving force that's in all of us. And it's a force to create and to overcome oneself, so self-overcoming, and to affirm life. And amongst these things, you have to embrace what he calls amor fati, embracing fate. You cannot regret the choices of your past. And then he also says, he comes up with this idea of the eternal recurrence. Now, I'm not going to talk about eternal recurrence, but it is in Dune, in Frank Herbert's Dune. You can see it there. But I'm not going to touch on it today. So if we're going to critique Nietzsche, right, and his idea of the Ubermensch, the self-overcoming individual that creates his own value set, transcends morality, right, and a lot of times people look at this and they will think that it's simply a strong dictator type individual, like a tyrant ruler or something. And Nietzsche didn't really view it that way. That's kind of like how it was twisted by Tiny Mustache Man in the 1930s. And some other people that have read into the text. But Nietzsche saw it more as a creative, joyous force, and not merely a violent one, this idea of will to power. So we'll talk about now Rodian Raskolnikov from Crime and Punishment as a failed Ubermensch. So Rodian Raskolnikov is a student in St. Petersburg, Russia, right? In the 1860s. He lives in a dilapidated apartment, and he's dressed in rags, and he thinks a lot. If you've read Dostoevsky's book, Notes from Underground, Rodian Raskolnikov is absolutely like an underground man. He is completely locked in his brain all day long. He's avoiding people. He's thinking crazy thoughts. And he comes up with this theory of the extraordinary man, in which he postulates that humanity is divided into the ordinary and the extraordinary individuals. So there's people that have what Nietzsche would call like a herd or a slave morality, and there's people that have a master morality, right? Like the rules don't really apply to these exceptional people. And Rodian Raskolnikov envisions this as kind of like the Napoleonic figure. He uses Napoleon as like his guide, okay, as an extraordinary man. Now you see in Dune, we'll talk about that, this master and slave, it's kind of there. And right at the beginning of Dune, you see when the Reverend Mother, Gaius Helen Moheim, has Paul Atreides, she says, put your hand in the box, and he puts his hand in the box. She has this whole thing where what's the test about? Is to test whether or not Paul Atreides is a human. So is Paul Atreides an animal? Because an animal would act on instinct and withdraw its hand, whereas a human would leave its hand in the box so that it can eliminate a threat to its species, okay? So it can transcend the pain. You can overcome the pain. So it's that idea of self-overcoming. But again, you see it. There is the ordinary individuals and the extraordinary individuals. We'll talk about more of this, but we'll get back to Rodian Raskolnikov and his whole Napoleonic complex here. So what he postulates and believes is that extraordinary men that have this Napoleonic, destiny or whatever, they have the right to commit crimes, even murder, if it serves a higher purpose. So you kind of see like this reasoning or this philosophical argument that, if I kill this person, like commit murder, and it's for a greater good. Like, he thinks that this woman, this specific pawnbroker, kind of reasons in his mind that she's horrible and that the world would be better off without her. And you could take all of her money and then use it to put yourself through school or to become a better man or whatever, and then use your skill set to help humanity. It's kind of a sick and twisted ideology, but he's dividing the world into these two classes of, like, basically cockroaches and extraordinary men or commoners or whatever. I mean, it's Rodian Raskolnikov has got problems, what I'm saying. So Raskolnikov ultimately fails as Superman because he does transgress traditional morality. He commits murder. But he cannot overcome his conscience. And his punishment, then hence in Crime and Punishment, he commits the crime, and then the punishment is, throughout the remainder of the novel, is both legal and psychological. So legally, under the law, of course, he'd go to jail for murder, but his psychological punishment is that he's tormented. He's dealing with his conscience not being able to overcome the morals and the moral law. Okay? And you could say he's haunted by guilt, and that maybe even his punishment is spiritual, since he seems to be wrestling with the idea of God, because Raskolnikov is an atheist, but then he meets this character named Sonia, and she starts to instill in him some sort of like Christian value and ethic. Okay? Dostoevsky uses Raskolnikov in Crime and Punishment as a critique of pervading philosophies of his day, such as Russian nihilism, atheism, and utilitarianism, as I already stated, that were circulating within Russia in the 19th century. He critiques this throughout all of his works, following his release from Siberian prison, where he was imprisoned due to being a member of the Petrashevsky Circle, who was then targeted by the Tsarist secret police, involved in a mock execution, in which the execution was stayed and he was instead sentenced to prison. He wrote about this in kind of a semi-autobiographical memoir. It's called House of the Dead. But he tackles these concepts and these ideas and these philosophies and wrestles with them in Notes from the Underground, Crime and Punishment, The Idiot, Demons, and of course, the brothers Karamazov. So moving on from Raskolnikov as a failed Ubermensch, we'll move on to Paul Atreides as kind of like the Ubermensch that becomes a success. And it's also tragic. You could view Raskolnikov as kind of a morality tale of what happens when you follow this, Overman mentality where you reject all traditional values and transgress the law. Well, Paul Atreides is the flip side of that because he succeeds. Paul is actually the culmination of a breeding program started by this secret sisterhood called the Bene Gesserit. And what he has been bred for through eugenics and designed for is to become a Quetzalcoatl heterak, essentially a super being that can transcend the bonds of time and space and the next level of human evolution. Essentially, he acts as Friedrich Nietzsche's Overman or Ubermensch. Now, this is interesting because it seems like this genetic super mentality or super powers or whatever he has is kind of like as the next stage of human evolution is something that Nietzsche writes about and envisions in his works, that the whole goal of humanity, the whole drive of humanity is preservation and advancement of the species. And how do you do this? Through pain, of course. So comfort leads to stagnation, and harsh living conditions and pain and adversity makes you stronger. That's kind of the whole thing. That's why the Sardaukar, on the elite fighting force of the Emperor, Carino, in the book, right? The Carino Empire, the Shaddam IV, planet Carino, his Sardaukar fighting force are so violently strong because they live on a prison planet. And that's why the Fremen on Dune are so elite and so good at surviving, is because they live in harsh living conditions. That's what makes them elite fighters. Okay? Very Nietzschean concepts that Frank Herbert has incorporated into his novel. So Paul, unlike Raskolnikov, actually becomes this Overman or this super being. And then he has to deal with the weight of his power once he becomes like essentially emperor of the known universe, right? Paul succeeds in gaining ultimate power, but it traps him. His prescience, his ability to see the future, okay, locks him into a future that causes a massive galactic war, which is known as the Galactic Jihad. And it's a burden that he initially struggles to avoid, but ultimately embraces. And in a way, he kind of becomes like Raskolnikov later on if you read Dune Messiah, right? Some of the further Dune books. And that Paul is kind of like a deconstruction of the traditional hero. Okay? He is a tragic hero. In fact, his very name, Paul Atreides, you see Atreides. Of course, that reminds us of the House of Atreus from Greek mythology, Homer specifically in the Iliad, the Odyssey, and the House of Atreus bore a curse. So there was a tragic downfall of the House of Atreus and Atreides family, of course, being connected to that. I believe it's even said in God Emperor of Dune that the Emperor Leto II actually traces his lineage back to ancient Greece, to the House of Atreus. It's kind of like foreshadowing, right? That Paul's end or this family line is going to be tragic. Okay, this is tragedy. This is like Greek tragedy. But Paul, he has a reluctant acceptance of his role, but later regrets it. And he has a desire to turn away from what he calls the golden path. I don't want to spoil that for you, but that plays prominently in the later Dune novels. So Paul versus Rodian Raskolnikov. Both characters are trapped by their superior abilities. Specifically, for Rodian Raskolnikov, it's his intellect, his mind. He is guilt-ridden because he's overly analytical. He fails his experiment. He breaks down and then seeks redemption. It's basically what's happened here. His core conflict is that it's his conscience versus his philosophical theories. Paul Atreides, on the other hand, his core conflict is prescience, his ability to like see the future and whatnot versus choice. So you have like free will versus fate. It's almost like Raskolnikov has the same problem because in chapter 5, Raskolnikov has, I guess, what you would call a prescient dream, where he sees in this dream, recalling his childhood, he sees a horse being beaten. And when he awakes from the dream, it's almost like he feels compelled to act out the crime that he has bred in his mind. In many ways, Paul has prescient dreams. The things that he dreams about comes true. So it's almost like Rodian Raskolnikov has these prescience, right? Like the ability to see the future. And it's almost like he's compelled to do it against his will. Now, is that really fate? Is that the influence of, demonic forces or the passions? I don't know. That's for you to read and figure out. I'm just saying there's these similarities here. But Paul ultimately transcends humanity, right? He becomes a godlike figure, but he is trapped. So in both cases, Friedrich Nietzsche's idea of the Uberman, the Ubermensch, does not work out well for either one of these characters. For Rodian Raskolnikov, who fails to become an Ubermensch, he ultimately ends up like just completely, psychotic almost, like just completely wigged out and has a mental breakdown. He's delusional. He's passing out in bushes and whatnot. And for Paul Atreides, who becomes this Ubermensch character, like, it's not all it's cracked up to be. He has a lot of regrets about it. So I really guess I don't have a whole lot else to say about this. I just thought I would note the similarities there, some of the weird stuff in there. And by the way, chapter 5 of, in part 1, chapter 5 of Crime and Punishment, it's almost weird because the character Rodian Raskolnikov has this dream about a horse being beaten. He wakes up from the dream and is like, he has like a mental break. Well, later on in real life, Friedrich Nietzsche, when he was in Italy, witnessed a man beating a horse. Years later, like 20 years after this novel was written, you almost wonder, did he read this? Did Nietzsche read Crime and Punishment? Nietzsche saw a man beating a horse and raced up to embrace the horse who was being beaten and had a total mental break and spent the rest of his life in a mental institution. That really happened. So, did Fyodor Dostoevsky have the spice agony? Was he the Quetzal's Haderach? Did he see the future? I don't know. You tell me. Anyways, thanks for watching. Leave a comment below if this interested you at all. Let me know what you think about it, your thoughts, feelings, whatever. Until next time. Or if we never see you again, hey, have a good one. Thanks for watching.